early. It's now 10:45. Can we start with a prayer? Lord, thank you. Thank you for this church. Thank you for each other. Thank you for this opportunity to come together. We thank you for the parables. Jesus taught this way, and it is so powerful. We are so well blessed in this place and in this country. We know that things are bad in many places, and we lament that and we pray about that, Lord. So help us to do what we can to make the world a better place. We ask your blessings to be with us as we study the parables here today for the first time. We pray this in the name of Jesus Christ, who is Lord and Savior. Amen. Amen. Okay, my name is Ed Coster, and welcome everybody. Couple things. If you are not on our mailing list, please give me your name and email address, and print it well. I will send you an email after the class about what's going on. If you don't have a name tag, please fill one out, because that's the friendliest thing we can do for each other. Is wear a name tag. I know. So I when we first started wearing a name tag for the first time, this church tried to
Pass it around.
pardon me.
Send it down this way, Jeanette.
The email thing is right there. And send it down that way when you finish, okay?
Well, yeah,
And then take.
I mean, when
Okay.
we're done here.
Okay, so we're gonna start today with the study of the parables. Now, this isn't gonna be like how we've done it before. We've studied the books of the Bible, and we've done it with in the standard way, that is, and we've done using it by a historical critical analysis, which asks the question, what was the intent of the writer? And how was it heard by the audience? How was it read by the audience? And it assumes, the historical critical analysis assumes there is, you can reach the right way to interpret it. And it's heavily dependent upon language and vocabulary and structure and usage. And so we talk about that a lot. A lot of citations to scripture. And so we go all over the Bible doing that. We have to look at the context, who the writer was, who the audience was, the politics of the time, the cultural norms of the time, the relationship with the Jews, the relationship with the surrounding culture, competing factors such as Gnosticism and other forms of religion. We had to look at the emergence of church traditions and history and theology. We had to look at the situation of the congregations and the geography, and look at the other writings of the Bible to do that. New Testament and Old Testament. And the basic aim of the historical critical model here is to take what the reader wrote, or the writer wrote, and interpret it in a way that was true to what the writer intended. All right. And that's because they were written. Okay, all these things were written. What we have here, well, consider this now. Consider the difference between a speech and a press conference. A press conference is verbal. It's oral. And in fact, that's intentional because, they like to catch people, politicians in different glitches and stuff. So consider that difference. the parables were spoken. And they were part of a dialogue. They didn't have the capability of recording them on the spot. They were later written down by memory. Now, understand now that the oral tradition that we really don't have anymore was far different than it is now. We see in Acts and in various places speeches of people. When you read the histories, particularly from Thucydides on forward, we see speeches. We see speeches all over in the literatures of the times and the historians of the times. And what happens is that people would stand up and preach something. There would be orators. This notion of oratory and rhetoric was a high art, and then people would remember it. And they would write them down. So we have speeches, for instance, in Acts that were recreations probably of memories of what people remembered. And they would come out different from different people who were writing the speech down. So from the beginning, a parable is different. It was the parables were spoken in Aramaic. That's Jesus's speech, and so it had to be translated. Sometimes parables appear in the Gospels in multiple versions. They're not the same parable, but they're not the same. So we have to take that into account. Some appear in one gospel only, particularly Matthew and Luke. There's a single parable in Mark that is in one God, and that's only in Mark. Some appear in two gospels, some appear in all three gospels. So we have all kinds of variations. And when they're in more than one gospel, they're rarely identical. So we have a different problem here. So we have to ask the question, why? Why aren't they identical? The common themes of the parables are the kingdom of God, or in Matthew, the kingdom of heaven, the end times, the return of Jesus, the inauguration of a new age, right behavior. How are you supposed to behave? Criticism of the religious establishment. So in the parables, the critical issue is interpretation, not trying to establish what the right meaning is. Because we have so many different versions, so many different parameters, the problem is, what does it mean? Sometimes parables are very clear. Some parables are unclear. You're just not sure what it says. Some are ambiguous. Some are offensive. I mean, if you read the Gospels and are never offended, you're probably not reading the right ones, or not reading them well. So the real question is, what does this parable mean? Not what did the writer intend, but what does this parable mean? Let me give you an example of that. Basically, until the 19th century, the way you interpreted a parable was by an allegorical meaning. Okay, let me give you an example of a parable of an allegory. Augustine's interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan. You all recall the parable of the Good Samaritan? A man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and on the way, he was attacked by bandits, basically, and beaten up and left by the side of the road. And along came a priest who ignored him, and along came a Levite who ignored him, and along came a Samaritan who looked out and helped him, who went in and tried his best to give him aid and comfort, and then took him to a nearby inn and left him in the inn, and paid the innkeeper to a good amount to care for this person. He said if there's any more left, he'd come back. All right, that's the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the question at the end was, who is my neighbor? Right? It arose because God said, who's my neighbor? And he ends by saying, who's the neighbor? Here's how Augustine, and he was not the first one to do this. And in fact, he borrowed from an earlier source for this allegorical interpretation. A certain man went down from Jerusalem. Augustine says Adam is meant. Jerusalem, he says, is the heavenly city of peace, from whose blessedness Adam fell. Jericho means the moon and signifies our mortality, because it is born, waxes, wanes, and dies. Thieves are the devil and his angels, who stripped him, namely of his immortality, who beat him by persuading him to sin, and left him half dead. Because insofar as man can understand and know God, he lives, but insofar as he is wasted and oppressed by sin, he is dead. He is therefore called half dead.
Oh, what?
He is therefore called half dead.
Oh, half.
The priest and the Levite who saw him pass by, significantly the priesthood and the ministry of the Old Testament, which could profit nothing for salvation. Samaritan means guardian, and therefore the Lord himself is signified by this name. The binding of the wounds is the restraint of sin. Oil is the comfort of good hope. Wine is the exhortation to work with fervent spirit. The beast is in the flesh, in which he deigned to come to us. The being set upon the beast is a belief in the incarnation of Christ. The inn is the church, where travelers returning to their heavenly country are refreshed after pilgrimage. The morrow is after the resurrection of the Lord. 2 pence are either the 2 precepts of love or the promise of this life and of that which is to come. The innkeeper is the Apostle Paul. The supererogatory payment is either his counsel of celibacy or the fact that he worked with his own hands, lest he could be a burden to any of the weaker brethren when the gospel was new, though it was lawful for him to live by the gospel. Now that is an allegorical method of interpretation. That's a common method. That was, well, I'll come back to that later. So that was the first way that it was interpreted. It's an allegory is a form in which the action and other elements have separate meanings independent of the story, and you can assign anything to it. It started. We find allegories in the Old Testament. You recall the allegory of the prophet Nathan to David Nathan, you recall David, saw Bathsheba from the top of his office, and he seduced her. And she was the husband of a soldier. And he sent the soldier off to die. And Nathan came and told this parable about somebody taking a poor person's lamb. Yeah. And Nathan says, so what should you do about that person? And he said, David was outraged about that and said he should be punished severely, should die. And Nathan said, you did that. And so we find parables. We see the parable of the vineyard in Isaiah, which is a parable about Israel. But it's not the it became into common usage in the era of about 200 BC and in Alexandria. Now, Alexandria is the same location as it is now, but it was the second largest city in the Roman Empire. And it was there was a very, very strong community of Jews in Alexandria. That's where the Greek Old Testament was translated from the Hebrew, the Septuagint. And there were the Alexandrian Jews wanted to attract Gentiles, speak to Gentiles. So they didn't speak Hebrew, so they translated the Bible into Greek.
Mm.
But how do you interpret to the Gentiles the stories of the Old Testament about the David and Goliath and the Amalekites, etc., which had no meaning to them? The whole notion of a God who created and sustained the universe had no meaning to the Greek philosophers. It didn't have any meaning at all to them. The law had no meaning, not as a moral code, no. And there's some wretched stuff that goes on in the Old Testament. And so how do you make that meaningful to the philosophers, to the Hellenists, to the Greek? Yes.
Were the people who spoke the parables, were they like well educated?
Oh, yes. These folks were very well
Yeah,
educated.
so these were teaching.
Oh, yeah.
Tools.
Yeah, and there was a whole lot of learning going on in Alexandria, particularly amongst the Jews. But actually, this huge, biggest library in the world was there, the library in Alexandria,
Right.
which was unfortunately destroyed by fire. So Alexandria was a major place, major place.
Okay.
And so how do you approach a Gentile with the Old Testament and say it has some meaning? You do it by allegory.
Yeah.
That's how they did it. And it was a powerful means of interpretation. Allegory was the primary method of interpreting the Bible until the Reformation. And understand now, the Reformation was a challenge to the authority of the church, specifically the Pope. And the church had spent all the 1,500 years now interpreting the Bible, and they had done it allegorically, and they'd come up to all kinds of crazy resolutions of it. And doctrine was set by Rome. And Martin Luther said, no, it's the Bible. And this turned people to reading the Bible. The Bible wasn't translated out of Latin. The original translation of the Bible for the church was done by Jerome in the 4th century, and it was a Latin translation. It was translation into the Latin. And that became the Bible of the Roman Catholic Church, basically until Vatican II. It was amended in the Reformation, during the Reformation. They clarified it and did some better scholarship on it and tried to update it. But the Douay-Rheims translation of the Bible into English was a Catholic Bible, and it was a translation from the Latin. Up until that time, starting with humanism in about the 13th century, the beginning of the Renaissance, scholars started to look at the original sources, partly because of the Crusades. Because Europe went into the Near East, and these guys came back with manuscripts held in Constantinople, manuscripts held by the Arabs, who were very good at translating manuscripts into Arabic. And so you began the Renaissance began with the notion of humanism, where scholars were given these manuscripts to read, not only biblical manuscripts, but manuscripts from Rome. And so they started reading the Roman manuscripts about Rome at its height that were not available in the West. And so there were some translations that people began to read and translate them into and make these translations available. The translations were available mostly to scholars, but first they began to go back to the original manuscripts, and they would translate them into the common language. Now, until the Reformation, these translations, there were many, but they were individual translations. And until 1611, these translations were made available. They were translated into English in a different language because of the Reformation, and they were translations by individuals. In 1611, with King James, he formed a committee of scholars. And we'll look at this later in a little bit in terms of versions. But he brought the best scholarship available, and they looked at the best texts they had available and created the King James Version. And that King James Version is the mother version of a whole lot of subsequent versions. We'll look at those, and it's going to be important to us to consider that. So all these versions developed, and with these different versions, which were in English, but there were also versions being translated. And Martin Luther's major accomplishment was translating the Bible into German. This began the beginnings of what we now call higher critical scholarship. Everybody began to read it. I dated a girl in high school who was Roman Catholic from a very large Roman Catholic family. And I once asked her about the Bible and what it meant. She said, I don't know. All I need to do is go ask my priest. Yeah, the Bible was interpreted basically by the church. And if a Catholic wanted to know what the Bible said, they went to their priest. With Vatican II, the Catholic Church cracked open and started authorizing other kinds of Bibles. But basically, with the beginnings of the Reformation, you started to have translations available in the common language, and people started reading it very closely. And so the allegorical method of interpreting the Bible fell aside. because people started reading it for what it said. Not for but how you could relate it to whatever you wanted to relate it. Now, and it was a development of the Reformation and humanism and higher critical methods. That's what killed the allegorical method, except that the major means of interpreting the parables remained allegorical until the 19th century. And by then, the higher critical method had accumulated, had generated enough momentum so that people started using higher critical methods to interpret them. But you know, the higher critical methods really don't work so well for that parables. There was still, the higher critical method assumes there's one proper interpretation of something. And the first kind of attempt to interpret the parables beginning in the 19th century assumed that each parable had one meaning. And there was a lot of scholarship about that, a whole lot of scholarship, until the middle of the 20th century, really. I had a professor in seminary who suggested that there was only one interpretation of every parable, which clearly modern scholarship, starting with the turn of the, starting with about 1950 or so, has abandoned that there is not just one interpretation. In some cases, there is one. In two cases, Jesus himself interpreted parables. The parable of the talents and the parable of the weeds and the wheat. And Jesus did it. And I think it's hard to interpret those two in any other way than by what Jesus did. But other than that, there's no interpretation. There's some suggestions, hints. There is context, and there are steps and stuff like that. But what's happened is that other than those two parables, there were multiple interpretations intended. In some cases, a parable could make sense only if it was intended to force us into different modes of thinking. So therefore, I cannot proceed to tell you what a parable means. Yes.
Would there, like different orders in the Catholic Church? Would they vary the translation or whatever of the parables kind of depend on the views of the order?
The interpretations, they all use the same translation, basically. The Vulgate, the Latin.
Okay,
But in terms of interpretation, I'm not knowledgeable about what you ask. I don't.
I just wondered if there would be differences of opinion amongst
Probably were,
different,
but there were lots of, I mean, the various orders in the Roman Catholic Church were very powerful and had a lot of, some of them, for instance, were specifically aimed at teaching.
right,
So they're the Dominicans, and for instance.
yeah.
But I'm not competent to be able to answer your question.
Good question.
So this class has got to proceed in a different way. It has to proceed in a different way. We will read the parables in class, right? One by one, sometimes two by two. I will give some information that is relevant to it, setting and maybe some historical information about the contents or whatever's there. And then I'm going to stop and give it to you.
Mhm.
So in this case, I just made Melissa Ann a liar. She said there's no homework. This will be what my role is going to be, is to First of all, I'm gonna assign a parable for each class beforehand.
Unknown color.
And second, my intent is gonna be to facilitate, the discussion. And try to keep it going, and try to keep people from hogging the floor, and try to, and I will give some rules for the discussion. Because, you know, some of this stuff is pretty powerful. And it's some of it's scary. And so, one of the things I'm gonna wanna do is keep us from hurting each other. You know, when you get into stuff that's this meaningful, people can hurt each other. And I will ask questions in class. I will sometimes put limits on questions in class and comments. I will make suggestions on occasion as to, for instance, it's possible to extend a parable too far. And apply it to things that weren't intended,
Yeah,
and that does happen a lot.
yeah.
So I will do things like that. And I will ask the question, how does the situation in the parable extend to us? And, yeah, and for the most part, I'm gonna try not to give any kind of definitive interpretation. So, what I will inform you of what we're gonna read the next Sunday. And for your information, we're gonna need to go next Sunday also with more information about parables. I haven't gotten specific about that yet. I will start getting specific this morning, and I don't think I can finish this morning, so we'll go into next week. We're gonna start probably in 2 weeks with a parable of the prodigal son. You can read it beforehand. You may want to read it beforehand. I will give you, that will give you the opportunity to read it and think about it. Many of the parables are found in two gospels or all 3. And to help you with your meditations on this and discussions, I intend to send you parallel versions by email on the Sunday email so that you can compare them. It's easier to do that. So if it's just one, it's found in one gospel, I will just give you that version. If it's in more than one, I will send it to you in parallel versions. What to do with it? First of all, I recommend you read it multiple times. One of the things that I found of scripture is that it opens itself up with multiple more times you read it. It's too easy to read it and say, well, that's what it means. Every time I read the Bible, and I've read a lot of the Bible, and I've read it a lot, I glean something new. So I recommend that you pray over it. I recommend you just muse and think about it. Go into some kind of internal dialogue maybe and start asking questions. What does this mean? And what does that mean? Here are some of the questions I suggest are appropriate for the class discussion and for your musings. And these are different questions than we've had before. The first of the questions is, how do I feel after reading that parable? You may find you're really challenged and troubled by it. What does it mean to me? Does it speak to my experience, and what experiences? And if so, how? Did Jesus intend there to be multiple interpretations? That's a question we want to ask. What is the setting? I will generally incidentally give you the setting when I give you in my part, the interpretation of it. But as you read it, you may want to search for that setting as well. What did Jesus intend to say? Did his audience get it? Who was Jesus talking to? Who was Jesus talking about? Was the response response of the audience important to understanding the parable? I mean, as part of the message of the parable, how people responded to it. Is there a religious moral? Is there an ethical moral? And this is an important element as you read it. What parts of the parable that you read are just set up? See, we can take these set up elements of a parable and try to expand them to something that aren't really intended. And we have to be careful with. What elements are part of the intended meaning? Where there are multiple versions, sometimes there are multiple versions. Are the settings the same? Are the conclusions the same? How do they differ in wording? And why? Do they have the same moral? How are the perspectives of the gospel writer seen? And as I say, these are all in gospels. The gospels have different perspectives. How did that affect what the gospel says? So now ordinarily, it doesn't make much difference really for when I have led the class, what version you read. It really doesn't make much difference. It does make a difference here. I'll tell you why. What we're going to be doing is interpreting the parables, interpreting them now. And they are open to many interpretations. Now, there are literally hundreds of different translations that you can read. These translations are not of all the same type. And for instance, there's a thing called formal equivalence, and I'm working here from reading that I've done. I have never formally looked at this until preparing for this class, but I will refer you in my email to a Wikipedia article that's readable and available and that you may find helpful. But part of it I will show you here this morning. There's a thing for translators called formal equivalence. That is to say, where the translator's intent is to take the words of the original and translate them into his own language, to his target language, in such a way that the words themselves appear in the translation in one form or another, so that in a formal way, so that by reading this in the English, you could have a sense of what the Greek said. Now, this is a very difficult proposition. I'll show you what I mean in a little bit here. Frequently, there are no equivalent words. And when you're talking about God, lots of times there are no equivalent words. Transubstantiation it's a totally invented word to talk about a doctrine of the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Right? So there's no word to describe it. Trinity is not found in the Bible, but it describes an interpretation of Jesus, who Jesus was. So that's one of the ways this kind of thing happens. But there are also the problems that certain ideas are not available to us. You know, we have notions of history that were not available to the writers, actually to any writers before the church, before about 500. So you had to invent words to describe ideas. And so this, when you come across a concept in Greek that makes sense in the Greek, but doesn't make sense in English, you got to try to do something with it. Sometimes when you get too close to the Greek and adhere to it too closely, it comes out as gobbledygook. I'll show it to you in just a minute here by what I mean. And so what you do is get very awkward readings. So the problem of this formal equivalence is difficult. You can't just take the words and translate them word by word. There are word by word translations around. All right. You will find the American Standard Version is probably the one most available to you. There may be an ASV here somewhere, certainly around somewhere. The American Standard Version is a common word for word interpretation. It tries to stay very close to it, but so close that it's very difficult to understand sometimes. King James is that way as well. On the other hand, there is a strategy, a translated strategy called functional equivalence, or a dynamic equivalence, where the interest of the translator is readability. Right? Now, this is very, very helpful sometimes. Way back when I first became a Christian in the evangelical sense, when I was at the Naval Academy, I picked up, I started reading a Phillips translation of the New Testament, J.B. Phillips. It's very, very helpful if you're brand new to the Bible, particularly since what I was reading was the King James Version. I have come a long way since then, but nonetheless, these versions are usually by individuals. They're by a group of people, and their intent not is to give you the sense of the text, but give you the sense of the meaning. Some of them are literally paraphrases. You can read the Living Bible, for instance, which makes no claim to being a translation. It is a paraphrase, basically from the King James Version, and it wants to favor a natural reading, and certain words or phrases have no equivalence. So they just they do the best they can. Now, the issue here is that by trying to give you a Bible that makes sense, it's a judgment call by the translator. The problem with that is they will have already made this interpretation of the parables. So if you read one of these things, there's gonna be a bias for the parable means this, say, for readability purposes. And this is not what we want. Now, you can try it if you want, help yourself. But let me give you, a sense of the, what I'm talking about here.
Is it that English is a problem because it has such a huge vocabulary?
It's any language is a problem.
Oh,
Okay, here, there's a family of texts called the King James Version. Do I have it up on the screen here?
Yeah, yeah.
The King James Version. I mentioned that, in King James, he was getting flack from all different directions about what the Bible said. And remember, he's the son of Elizabeth. Queen Elizabeth, and there was the England was just in the struggle breaking away from Roman Catholicism, and there were all these other different groups in England competing for what's right. And so he called together this group of scholars, this committee of scholars, and they translated this Bible into English, and it's a marvelous translation. In terms of beauty, in terms of the effect it's had on the English language itself, it's been stunning, literally stunning. Now, of course, you get this Elizabethan English with the these and the thys and the thous and stuff like that, that are not, that have passed into history. But, sometimes, it's very, very helpful to know when is a you a thee and when is a you thou, or these and thous and yous and plural or singular. Sometimes it's very helpful, but nonetheless, it remained the standard in the English language until 18. Let me see if I can get until 1895, when this came out in England, when folks decided that, first of all, the scholarship had advanced so much since 1611. I mean, they had hundreds more texts to choose from, and hundreds more possibilities, a better understanding of the Latin, a better understanding of the Greek, a better understanding of the Hebrew and the Aramaic. So there was a whole vast new scholarship available. So they got together a new committee and retranslated. And of course, they took out all of these and the thous and the thines and the et cetera, et cetera. And it put it into a more, this is basically Elizabethan English. Not Elizabethan, but Victorian English. It was a retranslation of the King James Version in the United States in 1901 called the American Standard Version. Now, this tries to render the text very, very close. And it's really awkward to read. Really awkward to read. In 1901. So there was a new translation of this in 1995 called the New American Standard Version. Now understand, bless us now. Let me interrupt right here. Worship starts at 11:30 right over there. If any of you wish to go to the 11:30 worship service, please feel free to go. It's not going to disturb me. I think it's going to be just fine. But I don't think I can contain myself. A Sunday school class is supposed to be an hour. It's in the Bible somewhere. Just like worship is an hour. So.
I bet it's in your computer.
Yeah. Pardon me?
I bet it's in your.
Yeah, it's in my, yeah. So at any rate, there's a new ASV that was translated in 1995, and that's an attempt to make the ASV more readable, but it's very accurate translation. It's a good one. I use it a lot. In 1952, the National Council of Churches, Protestant group now, understand Protestant group, which excludes Roman Catholics. The National Council of Churches the Roman Catholics were not a member of that. Got together and convened a very authoritative committee of scholars to come up with a new standard version. And all this is basically based on the King James Version, right? It's a derivative of the King James Version with new scholarship, new attention to language, etc. And this was in 1952. Now, if you read the original publication, the first edition of the RSV, you will find that the parable of the woman caught in adultery is in a footnote to John 8. Why? Because the best text that we have didn't have it there. It only occurred in later texts. And particularly the evangelicals and fundamentalists went bonkers. They just went crazy. That's not a footnote. That was certainly written by God. You know? So that's what the fundamentalists say. It's all written by God. Anyway, you can't have that kind of thing. So the first edition of the Revised Standard Version, you'll see the story of the woman caught in adultery in John 8 in the footnotes. So the second version puts it in the text itself, and there's a footnote saying it's not in the early versions. So, but at any rate, that was their attempt, and it's I am going to use, for purposes of our class here, the Revised Standard Version. I have been using the New Revised Standard Versions, but I'm going to use the Revised Standard Version when I read it here, and I'll show you why in a little bit. It's a personal decision, basically.
The 1952 one.
The 1952 version.
The these and the thous are out of that one.
Say that again.
That's the version without the these and the thous.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Actually, starting with the Revised Version, all of these and the thous are gone.
Yeah.
The 1895 version, and the ASV, there are no these and thous and those. So it tries to update the language.
I got some of those are pretty.
Yeah. Now, the NRSV was published again by the National Council of Churches in 1989 here. And their intent, there was new scholarship and a better understanding of the Greek and the Hebrew and all the other languages. But there are also some problems of bias in the text, in the translation. We see it most clearly in their handling of gender. What is clear, when I was in high school and when I was young, they would say, all men are created equal, was a generic word that intended men and women, right? Well, there were some who said, no, I don't. Whenever it comes in the Bible, if it says men, it means men. So the New Revised Standard Version takes for instance, and there are other places where it amends it basically translates words in a different way to say men and women. We read it all the time in Paul, where he said brothers and sisters, where Paul says brothers. New NRSV says brothers and sisters. So it's basically the Revised Standard Version, but with some amendments. Now, the difficulty, of course, with the Revised Standard Version and the NRSV is that it was written by liberals. It was translated by liberals scholarship. That is to say, it's not reliable for good Christians. So in 2001, a group of evangelical scholars
Oh, dear.
asked permission of the National Council of Churches if they could use the King James Version, the Revised Standard Version as a platform upon which they could do a translation, and they did, and it's called the ES English Standard Version. The ESV. It's quite a good version. It's very accurate. But it doesn't make all the mistakes that all those liberal scholars are trying to do.
Was it permission denied?
Pardon me?
Permission denied.
So I recommend. I go through this because these are really excellent translations for you. There are a bunch of other ones that come from this article, incidentally, that I have let me go to another. I think I've got. Here's another set of Bible translations that use. Now, this is going to be in the email, so you don't need to take notes here. All of this is going to be in the email, basically. The Douay Lands is a Roman Catholic from the Latin, and that's 1610. King James is by Protestant, by a committee of scholars. Young's literal translation in 1862. All of these use the predominant use of the formal equivalents, right? And so they're acceptable. You can find it. I'll show you where it's hard to read sometimes. The Revised Standard Version, the American Standard Version. There's a concordant version. These are the Revised Standard Version here. New American Standard Version, King James Version. There's Green's literal translation. Now, understand, for instance, that something like Green's literal translation is probably from a single scholar. There's the Third Millennium Bible. There's the Orthodox Study Bible, and I'm not sure whether that comes from the Orthodox Church or just from quote Orthodox Christians.
Is it Jewish?
Jewish, possibly the Jewish. There is a Jewish one here.
Just before that one.
Yeah, maybe the Orthodox too. There's a Third Millennium. So there are all these versions as well. So you have those available to you. And these will be in this, I will refer you to this article, this Wikipedia article that explains the difference well, and then gives all these lists that I have here. Now, let me give you why it's helpful to.
So I have a quick question.
Yes.
Yeah, without interrupt. What version of the Bible do we give to the children when we disperse the Bible?
I think we give them the New Revised Standard.
It used to be, when my daughter got it,
The what?
but it used to be the New Light, NLT, whatever that was.
Oh, it may be, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe,
it was-
maybe it was, maybe
Yeah,
it's.
and I don't know if they still do that, but that's what they were getting, and it's, it's a really a different, quite a different
Yeah.
translation.
You may be correct on that. I may be, yeah.
Like, I think it's like that, NLT. Because it's for children, different, today's English version.
Yeah, today's English version, something like that. I don't know.
I can email them, Christine. It's-
I'd have to check it. But give you an example. Here's the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. This is a formal equivalent translation of 1 Samuel 25:22. May God do so to David and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. Now, this is a story about David wreaking vengeance on his enemies. He's really mad at him. Here's a notion, it actually says, may God do so to me and to David more also. This is a concept that doesn't come through very well in English. So here's a place where even a formal equivalent doesn't help very much. That is a common oath in the Old Testament in the period of David. May God do so to me and more also if I don't do this. Or may God do so to him and more also if he does this or doesn't do this. It's an oath. So, but listen, watch King James Version of it here. May God do so and more also, so and more also do God unto me, the enemies of David, if I leave all that pertain to him by the morning light, any that pisseth against the law.
Well, what kind of talk is that?
Okay, here's a case where you have a concept, have a phrase that is offensive to many,
And
but
very
it just doesn't make sense. But who are the ones that stand up to urinate?
Men.
So if I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. You see the problems with translation. So that's a formal equivalency problem, and even then, you have to, you do better with the pisseth against the wall part, but you don't really clarify. So and more also do God unto the enemies of David, if I leave all that.
It's like if I leave him alive,
Yeah.
God will take care of him.
Yeah,
Is that it?
yeah,
Basically?
yeah, I'm gonna kill them all.
Yeah.
And this is an oath that David is saying. And of course, the very concept that he would go and kill them all, which would not have surprised anybody in the old world, because that's in most battles in the old world. There were no survivors of the losing side, except
Right.
those that fled, but
Yeah.
frequently they were hunted down. So this is a case where you do the best you can. And that's, I will, as I prepare you, I will try to help you with this kind of stuff here, to leave so much as one man alive, even when we read the parables. Okay,
When you see something like this and you figure it out, it's like, basically, he wants to stomp out the guy's
Yeah.
whole
you
line.
can go on.
Okay, now, will you find that, is that like a common thing that you'll find over and over, so that if you find this particular thing again, you'll kind of already.
Look up in
figured it
King
out.
James Version, the concordance for this is against the wall. You're gonna find about half a dozen or so.
Oh, dear.
Citations to it. So,
Okay,
but it just means male.
yeah,
It doesn't mean they're gonna all be killed.
yeah,
Okay, folks, next week, we're gonna continue with this. And so, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, now should we be looking for the email here?
You should be getting, pass me the, make sure your name's on the email list.
Everybody
And you should be getting that.
I'm so overwhelmed with junk mail that I could miss it, you know what?
your name?
I'm first on the. You can expect it.
Good for you.
Okay,
Okay, thank you all.
thank you.
Thank you.
I didn't know they had dirty jokes in the Bible.
Well, this is a good.